We are in the 26th chapter of Isaiah. Last week we finished the section in verses 1 through 10 that were an exhortation to trust in God. So now then, starting in verse 11 and going through verse 15, there is the section I titled, God's Enemies Are Put to Shame to God's Glory. And in verse 11, he tells us, Lord, when thy hand is lifted up, they will not see, but they shall see and be ashamed for their envy at the people. Yea, the fire of thine enemies shall devour them. The Lord's hand is lifted up. That is, it is against his enemies. We could add that while it is against the enemies that he's talking about specifically here, God's hand is also lifted up in protection of the faithful. It works both ways. The punishment of the evildoers, the protection of those who are faithful, those who are doing right. You might remember the passage in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, in verse 12, that the Lord's face is against them that do evil, but the Lord's hand, I can't even quote it now. 1 Peter 3:12. Yeah, that's part of it. That's the part I quoted. And I got stuck because John 9:31 is in my mind now. So, the part I was going to get to, though, the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. So you've got the contrast, Lord's eyes over the righteous, face against them that do evil. Well, you have the same type of a situation here, and that Lord's hand is lifted up, but it's going to be specifically against his enemies, but if it's against his enemies, it's also in the protection of the faithful or the righteous. But these enemies refuse, but they shall see and be ashamed for their envy at the people. They will not, or they refuse to see God's hand in everything. They thus fail to be impressed with his greatness and his power and the fact that he is in control. One of the great themes of Daniel is that God is in control. And you see that in particular, starting in the first chapter even, but as you go through and you come to that time in which Nebuchadnezzar looks at everything and, it's so powerful, and look at how great I am, and his pride, and God brought him down. And in that, as Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar what's going to happen to him, part of it is till you learn that God is in control. That's basically one of those great themes. Well, God is in control here as he punishes even his own people, but then he's going to punish those who are against his people as well. But they fail to see it. They don't recognize what Nebuchadnezzar learned, that God is in control. They were being used by God to accomplish His purpose, but they didn't know it. They thought it was their own power, their own greatness, or attributed it to their idol or idols. But the point that he's getting to here is that they are eventually going to see and come to shame over it. Finally going to realize, that the light turns on finally for them. I think of some individuals and the light never turns on. But because they continue to refuse to see. But eventually they're going to realize God is in control. They're going to be ashamed for their envy at the people. So it's going to bring them or cause them to have shame. They are also in that going to realize God's zeal for His people. And in connection with that, while He has a zeal for His people, He's going to bring about wrath to those who are proud and rebellious. And that wrath is going to bring the nations to shame, so that the fire of thine enemies shall devour them. The adversaries are going to be destroyed or devoured by a fire from within themselves. I think we can observe a principle of that a lot of times in relationship to someone who is very powerful and has a lot of influence, or else they want that, and that fire just burns within them and destroys them finally. That's why he's talking about in relationship to these individuals, these enemies of God's people. And I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but the Israelites could kind of say, we got God on our side. Just go ahead, see what you can do. Now that would not have been their attitude, I'm saying, but that's really what we're seeing. They're going to be, those enemies are ashamed because they realize God's on their side. And He's too powerful. He controls things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of a revisionist history, isn't it, when they would claim we've never been in bondage. True. They took it from a physical standpoint while Jesus was speaking from a spiritual standpoint. But even from a physical standpoint, that's revisionist history. Because from their beginnings, they were in bondage. Where did they become a great nation? In bondage to Egypt. How many times did they go into bondage during the period of the judges? Numerous times. Had 15 judges. Some of the oppressions during the period of the judges were localized and were not all of the people. Some of them were all of the people. So that's why I didn't try and give that number 15. It was just a general statement. During that period, they were in bondage a lot. They were under oppression a lot. during the time of the kings, especially during the divided kingdom period. Both the northern and the southern kingdoms repeatedly defeated in battle and under the bondage of the nation that defeated them. Finally, of course, the northern kingdom taken off into Assyrian captivity by Sennacherib in 722. And they were never brought back as a people to that land. There were individuals within those tribes that did return to Jerusalem, but as a nation, it did not. But then in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians took the southern kingdom and Jerusalem into captivity. Actually, it starts at 606 BC, and as was prophesied, 70 years. But even during the time of their restoration under Cyrus and the kings who followed him, guess what? They were still under the subjection of those nations, under the Medo-Persians, under the Grecian, and then if you get into that period of the Intertestament period, you had several bondages during that time. And guess who they were under at this time? When Jesus made that statement, and they made the statement, we've never been in bondage to anyone. They were in bondage to Rome. And what they wanted was a deliverer who would deliver them from Roman bondage. That's what they were looking for in a Messiah. And Jesus did not fulfill that, and so there's that controversy between Jesus and the people because he wasn't meeting their expectations. And let me just add this. Jesus would not meet the expectations of the majority of people today, and especially in the denominational world and even in the Lord's church. He would be a total disappointment to them. They would rebel against him and they would hate him because he would not succumb to their perversions of what he taught. I'll add this. In a Facebook group, there was a discussion on baptism, whether it's needful for salvation. And there were some who were arguing against it, or at least a couple. And so someone piped up that you need to go love somebody and quit this needless fighting. Well, I couldn't keep my big mouth shut, so I said, you mean that someone's eternal destiny is needless? It's not worth anything? And so he came back with the quote of avoiding foolish questions. And so I said, you talking about the eternal destiny of man is a foolish question as to where he's going to spend eternal salvation? That's a foolish question? He didn't respond. I don't know why. But that person, I suppose he was a member of the church. Jesus would be a total disappointment to him and many others.
I've been told worse than something like that, where you just gotta love them out.
Yeah, that's kind of what.
They're wrong, so we
Just have to love them out of it.
How do you do that? They don't even know what they're saying, and you can't tell who they are. How are you going to love them out?
He mentioned go love someone in his first comment, and I said, true love shows concern for someone's eternal destiny to try and teach them the truth. Well, that would be the case as well, but true love does not tolerate sin. It exposes sin and tries to get people to leave the sin and to come out of it. Right, if you spoil the rod, you hate your child. And so many of our parents need some of those lessons that are found in Proverbs today. Concerning this verse, though, Homer Haley wrote, "The fierce wrath of the Assyrian served Jehovah as his instrument of judgment, though the Assyrian did not mean to serve him." And he references Isaiah 10, verses 5 through 7. Likewise, the violent rage of the Chaldean involuntarily served him, Habakkuk 1, 5 through 11. Cyrus the Persian, whose ambition was to conquer the world, was Jehovah's instrument of judgment against the world of that day, Isaiah 45, 1 through 7. This burning fire of ambition, pride, and conquest within the worldly consumes them. So each one of those was the instrument of God, but they wanted all of the power, all of the credit, everything for them. And literally it did consume them. It consumed Nebuchadnezzar, it consumed Sennacherib, and the reason they went to war was to conquer the world, so show how great they were. And that's kind of what this verse is saying. They are God's instrument of punishment, but God is in control, and their pride and rebellious nature finally consumes them. So in verse 12, he mentions, "Lord, thou wilt ordain peace for us, for thou hast also wrought all our works in us." God will give peace. God will give peace to his people, for his people. We're supposed to switch to that. The New King James Version, that's not very big, but in verse 12, "You will establish peace for us." Instead of the idea of ordain peace for us. And establish would be maybe a better translation of the Hebrew word here. The Hebrew word literally means, according to one, Gesenius, quote, "to place, to put, to spread out, and to spread over." There's another lexicon. Its abbreviation is HAL. It's the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon. Says, quote, "to put something into another place." That's the idea of this word that's translated ordain, or in New King James, establish. God's going to put into place peace. God puts into place peace for them, but he also for us. And while this might not be speaking specifically to us, it yet has a great lesson for us, because God gives us peace. Someone read Romans 5 and verse 1 real quick, just to mention a passage or two.
Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, we have peace. Why? Because we are justified in the sight of God. And thus we have peace. That is peace with God. God gives us peace. And peace is not the absence of alarm, though. Where was Paul when he wrote the book of Philippians? In jail, in Rome, and about to stand trial before Caesar Nero. And yet he could, in that book, tell them that you have a peace that passeth all understanding. A peace that, not the absence of alarm, because from a human standpoint there was plenty of alarm in that situation, true? So it's not the absence of alarm, but as one person put it, it's not the absence of alarm, but it's the presence of God. And I think I've always remembered that. That was one of my teachers back in Harding that said that. I've remembered it through the years. The presence of God. Because I know that I'm in a right relationship with God. He has given me peace. And thus, I don't have to worry about what's going to happen. If I live, I live unto Christ. If I die, Christ is going to be magnified in my body. That's what Paul says there in the first chapter.
I would imagine Paul had some alarm when he was in that ship and it was about to burst down all pieces, but he was still at peace there. He told all of them, don't worry.
On the journey to Rome, after appealing to Caesar in the last couple of chapters of Acts, everyone was fearful except for him. And he had peace. But there was an alarm from a physical standpoint. You remember, and Paul loves the song, Master, the Tempest is Raging. What's it about? Time in which Jesus stilled the waters, the storm. He was asleep in the hind parts of the ship, and what did these apostles, what were they thinking? Lord, carest thou not that we perish? And he rebukes them and then calms the sea. They were afraid because they didn't really understand the peace of God. They didn't understand who they had with him either. And so Jesus rebukes them for their fear. He wasn't afraid, though, in the midst of that storm. Dale?
One of the instances in John, I can't remember where it's at, but it says the ship, they didn't use this exact wording, but they were where they were heading. The ship just got there that quick.
That was when Jesus walked on the water.
But there was one time the boat shot across the water, it seems to say. Just like when the door was shut, and he all of a sudden was moving.
That was when he walked on the water. And they were having difficulty arriving, and he comes walking upon the water, and when he gets in the boat, they were at the other side.
Yeah, right.
So, but God puts peace into our hearts as well, because we are in a right relationship with him. Someone read John 14 and verse 27. Okay. I'm going to give you peace. It's not like the world gives. The world thinks peace is if there's no wars going on. You know, if this country's not fighting this country and this one's not fighting this one, and all of these wars that we get into, if there's no wars, then we have peace. Well, that's the world's idea of peace, but not the peace that God leaves into us. And if you notice that phrase, let not your heart be troubled, that's where peace is. It is within us because we have that right relationship with God, because we have obeyed that gospel of Jesus Christ and thus have that peace. Here as well, he's setting forth that they are no longer going to lean upon their own understanding. They're not going to follow their own ways. Their own ways had failed. God is the one who had plotted their course, and their deliverance and thus peace had been wrought by God. And thus they could have true peace, something that other nations did not really possess. In verse 13 then, O Lord our God, other lords besides thee have had dominion over us, but by thee only will we make mention of thy name. If you look at these words, O Lord, that one's all caps in this. It is Yahweh or Jehovah, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Then you have our God, then that would be Elohim. Other lords. Lords there is the Hebrew Adonai, or Adon. Other lords, Adon had dominion over them. It's probably a reference to their idolatry. Go back, somebody read chapter 2 and verse 8. Okay, there's the worship of basically idols that he's dealing with. And yet, this was the Israelites worshiping idols. Someone read Amos 5, verses 25 and 26. Okay, there's their Moloch, and he also mentions their other idols that they had made. So when he says, other lords besides thee have had dominion over us, he is probably having reference to their idolatrous worship. But here's the other aspect. That word could also reference foreign rulers. And obviously, foreign rulers had control over them. And that would be in harmony with the curse that we read in Leviticus chapter 26 and verses 15 through 17. Where it says, and if ye shall despise my statutes, or if your soul abhor my judgments, so that ye will not do all my commandments, but that ye break my covenant, I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and the burning arg that shall consume the eyes, and cause sorrow of heart. And ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. And I will set my face against you, and ye shall be slain before your enemies, that they that hate you shall reign over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. So here's those who hate them are ruling over them. A lord, the kings that would have been ruling over them. And so that would be harmonious with that curse, because obviously through the years, and as Isaiah has been presenting, they were not faithful to God. They did not keep his covenant. And so other lords having dominion over them. But as I say, I think it probably has reference to the idolatry that is being referenced here. And it was a continuing problem for the Israelites. Right? If from the time in which they left Egypt, even and within a few days they're making a golden calf. And all through their history, they were idolatrous. With God's victory over their enemies, though, a new relationship is going to be found. And that is that Yahweh our God, by thee only will we make mention of thy name. So there's that new relationship that they recognize only God is our Lord, or only Yahweh is our Lord, not these others. They're not going to any longer serve and worship idols. They're only going to make mention of his name. It's interesting, at least from the history that we have, and both from biblical and secular, that that while idolatry was a continuing problem, after the period of period in which they've gone into captivity, specifically Babylonian captivity, and Cyrus then allows them to return in 536 BC. From that time forward, we do not see idolatry in Israel anymore, or in Jerusalem, or the Israelite nation. So here's this captivity, and now then what happens? Only worship of God. Now then, they might not have done everything that they should have been doing. I'm not saying they were always obedient to God, but they did not go off into idolatry as they had previously. In verse 14 then, he says, they are dead, they shall not live, they are deceased, they shall not rise. Therefore hast thou visited and destroyed them, and made all their memory to perish. I didn't actually look at the New King James or the American Standard, but in the King James, if you omit the they are at the beginning of the verse, really that's the idea that is being presented. Just omit it and read it that way. Dead, they shall not live. Deceased, they shall not rise. it's very emphatic in the way in which it's put. And he's talking about these lords, other lords. That's who he's dealing with in this verse. What is it? Dead, deceased. They're not going to live. They're not going to rise. That's their condition of these other lords. And that's why I say I think it's dealing more with idols than with physical nations and kings. These lords, these idols that they had served, they were dead, lifeless, the works of men's hands. Someone turn over to Isaiah chapter 44 and read verses 9 through 20. Isaiah 44, 9 through 20, because it's a great description of idols.
They that make a graven image are all of them vanity, and their delectable things shall not profit. They are their own witness, they see not, nor know, that they may be ashamed, who hath formed a God, or molten a graven image that is profitable for nothing. Behold, all his fellows shall be ashamed, and his workmen, they are of men. Let them all be gathered together, let them stand up, yet they shall fear, and they shall be ashamed together. The smith with the tongs both worketh with the coals, and fashioneth with hammers, and worketh it with the strength of his hand, arms. Yea, he is hungry, and has strength, and his fainteth. He drinketh no water, and is faint. The carpenter stretcheth out his roof, he maketh it out with a line. He fitteth it with flame, he maketh it out with a compass, and maketh it after the figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. He heweth him down cedars, and maketh the cypress and the oak, which he strengthened for himself among the trees of the forest. He planteth an ash, and the rain doth nourish it. Then shall it be for a man to burn, for he would take thereof, and warm himself. Yea, he kindleth it, and maketh bread. Yea, he maketh a god, and worshipeth it. He maketh it a graven image, and falleth down thereunto. He burneth part thereof in the fire, with part thereof he eateth flesh. He roasteth and is satisfied. Yea, he warmeth himself, and said, Aha, I am warm, I have seen the fire. And the residue thereof he maketh a god, even his graven image. He falleth down unto it, and worshipeth it, and prayeth unto it, and saith, Deliver me, for thou art my God.
Down through verse 20.
They have not known or understood, for he hath shut their eyes, that they cannot see, and their hearts they cannot understand. And none considereth in his heart, neither is there knowledge or understanding to say, I have burned part of it in the fire, yea, also I have baked bread upon the coals thereof. I have roasted flesh and eaten it, and shall I make the residue thereof an abomination? Shall I fall down in the stalk of a tree? He feedeth on ashes. A deceived heart hath turned him aside, that he cannot deliver his soul, or say, Is there not a lie in my right hand?
A very graphic description of the stupidity of the people that are making these idols. But it's very expressive also that they are dead, lifeless, deceased, the works of men's hands. God has vanquished them, and they will never be raised, and even the memory of them is going to perish or be forgotten. Think of all of those idols that we read about in the Bible. Where are any of them worship today. It's kind of, we read about them, we know a little bit about them, but nobody worships them today. They are forgotten. While this could refer to the nations who had been over them and terrorized them, and those nations being destroyed and remembered no more, and because of time I won't read, you could read Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 11, Jeremiah 46 and verse 28, Daniel chapter 7 verse 12 and 26. It still has specific reference to the idols that Israel had served and that the nations had served. Wayne Jackson pointed out, this passage does not negate the biblical doctrine of the general resurrection of the dead, including the wicked. Rather, it merely describes the abiding desolation of those who oppose the judge of the living and the dead. They are not dead and shall not live in the sense that they're not going to be in the resurrection. They will be raised, and they will stand before God in judgment for what they did and spend an eternity based upon that. This does not have reference to that resurrection. It's very simply stating that in point of time with the people, they are forgotten. They are dead. They're lifeless. They're not going to come back to life. They're not going to be restored because of what they did. Verse 15 then, thou hast increased the nation, O Lord. Thou hast increased the nation. Thou art glorified. Thou hast removed it far unto all the ends of the earth. As opposed to the destruction of the nations, God has increased His nation. That is, God's people. Someone read Isaiah 11 and verse 9, and then someone else be prepared to read Revelation 7 and verse 9. Okay. The earth shall be full of the knowledge of God. Revelation 7 and verse 9. A great multitude, which no man can number. That's God's increasing His nation, His people. It is a righteous people. And Isaiah 26 and verse 2, he says, open ye the gates, that the righteous nation which keepeth truth may enter in. Well, this is the increase of that nation, the righteous nation. Well, I was hoping to get through verse 15, but I don't think we're going to, so especially since Andrew rang the second bell already. We'll stop there, and Lord willing, next week, start with verse 15 and go on.